Good afternoon. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for coming today. I think you will not be disappointed. We're going to present a report that Professor Sergei Erofeev and I wrote on the Putin Exodus, the new Russian brain drain. And in a sense, this report came from a question that I've had for years, which was essentially this. How could a country which produced so many Nobel laureates in mathematics and science not be among the leaders in creating worldwide companies in the high-tech area? And while that question is not directly answered by this report, it speaks to the issue of how a country becomes a world-class economy today. And we know that whatever its merits, Russia does not enjoy a world-class economy. It joins an economy which has prospered when hydrocarbon prices have been high. And we know that while Russia has produced the world's greatest hackers, it has not produced the world's greatest tech companies. So this is a report essentially about human capital. How does a country develop and retain it? And, there's been a lot of attention paid in the Russian media, in the Western media, to talent leaking out of Russia over the past 15 years. Of course, Russia historically has had many waves of emigration, including during the 1990s, given all the turmoil in the post-Soviet Russia. But the interesting thing, which our report looks at, is the fact that while the Russian economy did very well in the early aughts, one, because the Kremlin did impose fiscal discipline, which was their achievement, but equally, if not more important, because you had a sharp rise in oil and gas prices. Even in that period, there was not insignificant Russian emigration. We know that under President Putin, 1.6 to 2 million people have left Russia. And we know that in the second Putin iteration, since he became president for the second time in 2012, the number of Russians leaving has been greater. While this has been discussed at certain length, what has not been discussed is a close reading of the motivation for people leaving. And that's what this report tries to do. And I'll leave it to Sergei to describe the report in more detail, because he's the social scientist who really put together the heart of our method, which drew in the findings. But I'll just go over some of the main findings that we have. First, we document that the emigration is highly educated. Let's see, what are my numbers here? 45% of those who left have bachelor's degrees, and 36% have either master's or doctorates on top of the bachelor's. Considering the fact that a significant portion of those who've left were young, in other words, didn't have time to go to college yet, that's a very large number. So in other words, talented people are leaving Russia. We also got good data on why they left. So 40% said they left because of the general political climate. And people were able to provide more than one reason. That's why you'll have more than 100% in the numbers I'm about to give you. 33% spoke of the lack of political rights. 32% spoke about the problematic economic situation and the lack of personal opportunities. 29% singled out political persecution. 26% singled out the lack for themselves of job opportunities, and 24% spoke about educational reasons. Now, significantly, 58% of the people said they were living comfortably in Russia, and they chose to leave. So this was not an emigration, or this is not an emigration forced by hard circumstances. This is an emigration of choice. And I've just described to you the choices, the reasons why they chose to leave. There has been in Western political culture, in the US in particular, very substantial criticism of President Putin. And my center, the Eurasia Center, has not been shy to criticize the Kremlin. But even as we've criticized the Kremlin for the dangers of its policies, we recognize that Russia is not the Soviet Union. The threat posed by Putin is not the same as the threat posed by his Soviet predecessors. And I'm mentioning that here because the one thing that Putin's Russia has not done is not forbid its people from traveling or from emigrating. And that's a very good thing for those people who choose to leave. But it's also not something which has been driven by altruism in the Kremlin. What analysts believe, and I consider myself one of them, is that Russia has permitted these people to leave. They want to reduce the number of those who disagree with the authorities. So it's done for politically self-thinking reasons. But of course, the question is, what does that do for the country? What does that do for the economic development of the country? Because we know, especially in the information age, human talent is critical for development. We know, however, that if Putin's interest is only self-survival, maybe that's the right choice, because these folks do not believe in Putin's Russia. Over 70% of them think that Russia's future lies with the West, with opening their society. That's a very large number. Their attitudes also demonstrate the limits of one of Putin's foreign policy tactics. He's created this notion of a Ruski mir, of a Russian world, in order to leverage Russians outside of Russia as instruments of Kremlin foreign policy. The point is that the new Russian diaspora wants no part of that. They want a Russia that looks much more like France than like Belarus. And that makes this diaspora a natural ally and bridge for those of us in the West who believe that, one, we have to stop Kremlin aggression, and two, that Russia's future need not be that of an authoritarian empire. With that, I'd like to call our panelists. We have a wonderful panel to talk about this issue with you. We have Dr. Sergei Erofeev, who will talk about the report. We have Yevgenia Albats, perhaps the greatest political commentator in Moscow. And we have Elizaveta Osetinskaya, a very, very prominent journalist, a Russian-American journalist based in San Francisco. So please, ladies and gentlemen. Sergei, I'd like to give you the first word on the panel, because I went over the report very briefly. In a few minutes, can you just describe basic points you think you need to make?
Thank you very much, John. To start with, it's a great feeling to be engaged in a project like this. We are truly pioneering the uncharted waters, although it would be wrong to say that nobody has tried to look into the causes of this most recent Russian immigration. But it's not only the first time when we do both extensive survey and a series of focus groups of the actual émigrés in 4 Western locations. It's also the first public event of this sort. So we are all participating in this pioneering event right now. Well, to start with, the causes, the drivers and factors of the new Russian immigration is not the only purpose of the study. We do indeed want to focus more and go into greater depth about these factors and causes and drivers, and give a broader picture for that, more substantiated by a literature review of what has been done so far and by the actual data that we obtained. The data is very rich, and we are only scratching the surface in a way right now, so it calls for more investigation and statistical analysis as well. But in itself, what we're dealing with, what we are engaged with, is a very, very rich scientific target in its own right. So by itself, this phenomenon calls for special attention. Maybe some could even think of this phenomenon as a chance to conduct a kind of seismic investigation of what is going on in Russia. So what are the tectonic things which cause not only certain people to leave, but might cause certain changes in the country of Exodus and may also affect the lives of other countries, including this country. So apart from the causes which are metaphorically packed under the term Exodus, we are also interested in the implications of this most recent emigration, both for the future of Russian economy, maybe politics, and for the lives of these people in the West, because the West remains the main destination, even for the new emigration. And beyond those personal lives in the West of these people, what do we do with these people? How do we make sense of their possible engagement with various things in our global world? Are they part of global brain circulation rather than brain drain? Are they at all interested in the futures of Russia as compared to the previous waves of Russian immigration? These are all big questions. And even the metaphor itself, the metaphor of Exodus, we intentionally using that while understanding that it doesn't really unravel everything that what can be characteristic of this recent wave. Of course, the obvious hint when we use the word Exodus is of biblical nature. So we are looking at the ancient story of going out to freedom. And there was a strong anecdotal evidence before we started our research that compared to the previous waves, the new wave, which was not so economically deprived as John just explained, could have a different set of values, different drivers, including pulling drivers. So there's certain push factors, and the political climate and general political situation is playing a greater role now, as the data shows. It's no longer anecdotal evidence, it's the data. But there are also pulling factors. What are these people attracted to? What are they seeking in this new situation? Would they be at all interested in the country of Exodus? Would they be at all interested in some kind of involvement into building a future for Russia? We understand that we can't talk about the overall population in this respect, but we can talk about some people and some dynamics. And I would like to conclude this little introduction with the fact that our hypothesis about the difference between the two cohorts within this new immigration wave, our hypothesis has been proved to be true. So those who left Russia after 2012, after Putin's return as president, those people do not only stay in touch more with the country, with their families. You can always refer to the time factor and the technology factor here, but they are also more interested in Russian politics. They are closely following the Russian news, and there is a very interesting structure. We got very interesting data, what people follow, how they discuss Russia. So there's more data to be processed later. And even we came to a very interesting picture when people say that, especially those who immigrated after 2012, that they are more supportive in various kinds, from discussing that with the family to actually donating to campaigns or somehow participating in an online oppositional campaign. So they're more supportive of what they understand as the Russian non-systemic opposition of a new kind, which has become very manifest through the last 8 years or so.
Thank you. Yevgenia, from Moscow, you're sitting there, do you think the reasons that we describe in the report for people leaving seem to make sense? Are these understood?
I think it's, first of all, thank you very much for bringing me all the way down from Moscow to Washington, D.C., and thank you very much to all of you for coming. I think it's a very interesting question, and I think it's not that much black and white. I would be very cautious using, this word Exodus, precisely if you're talking about the biblical perspective. There was, the situation back in Egypt was a little bit different than Russia, but, we're not going to delve into that, right? So, I think that also in terms of numbers, what, it's not working? Okay, I'm sorry, probably I did something. So I think also in terms of numbers, there was there has been this recent report done by the independent Russian pollster Levada Center, which suggested that in the demographic group 18-24 years old, which are we're the most interested in, only 42% said that they are ready to immigrate or likely immigrate, as opposed to 53% who said no, and likely they are not going to immigrate. And the reason for that is clear-cut. It is that there is lack of education and skills that are needed in order to succeed in the West. Russian so-called higher education, unfortunately, remains pretty weak compared to the universities, for instance, in this country. And also another problem is that people are lacking language skills, which are also needed in order to succeed outside the Russian Federation. However, to be honest with you, the problem is that I'm all in favor of the immigration. I am in favor because I believe that one of the worst mistakes that West made with respect to Russia was to close borders. I think that opening borders was extremely important in order to expose Russian people to the Western way of life. Just recently, Levada ran a questionnaire with respect to where people go, which countries they visit. And even though it's a little bit difficult to judge by the outcomes, but still we see that of those 42% who said that they did travel abroad in the last 5 years, 16% who answered this question went to Turkey, to Egypt, and to China, meaning this is bitches. There are only 6% who went to Europe. Whereas I believe that it's extremely important, especially for the young people in Russia, to get out to the Western world, to touch this real life in the Western countries, to see the politics, to experience these democratic politics. Because people are very susceptible to propaganda when they don't know what it is in the real life. So that's why I do think that it's good if Russians travel abroad, go abroad, and if they stay, it's okay too, because when and if the Putin regime collapses, and it will sooner or later, sure. And as any, look at Venezuela, for instance. So definitely there will be a call for Russians from abroad to get back to the country, and to because we will be in search of people with such values as honesty, integrity, and common good. These people who will staff the offices of the Russian bureaucracy in the new bright Russia, as we say in Moscow. Yeah. So anyway, so from that perspective, it's also good if you guys in the West train our future bureaucrats and our future politicians. So we're very grateful to you for doing this. Please do, and please allow more young Russians to come to the West, to study here, and to get knowledge about life in the countries where common good is not just a play of words. Thank you.
Thank you. That was trenchant as always. Elizabeth, I want to turn to you, but before that, I want to throw a quick question to Sergei. All right. Your last point, Evgenia, is very interesting. You said that you believe that you kind of said, this was implicit, that the people who are leaving now are learning about the West and how we do things, and then you kind of are expecting them to come back.
That's what happened in Georgia. But I'm sorry for interrupting you.
Please?
That's precisely what happened after the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, when Saakashvili placed a call to Western educated Georgians who were not connected to the corrupted Shevardnadze regime in Georgia, and the absolute majority of those who comprised the government in Georgia after the revolution were people who studied in the West.
Indeed.
And who worked in the West.
And
that's important.
You had a similar phenomenon working out in a different way in the Baltic states. But
and it didn't work out, by the way, in Ukraine. And that's the problem that Ukraine has now.
It's actually worked out partly in Ukraine, but you're right, not to the same extent. I mean, I can list ministers in the Ukrainian government who came from the West, Ukrainian nationals, but let's put that to the side right now. Sergei, our report looked at this. You want to address this issue too about the connections between people in the emigration and the possibility of them coming back, and then I'll turn to you, Liz.
Okay, our data clearly shows that this is a very, very small minority who are right now thinking that they might go back to Russia. But there's a very interesting distinction among those who immigrated after 2012. That small percentage is slightly higher. This is one thing. And the other thing is that we use two questions. One question is, would you return to Russia if the economic situation improved, but the political situation stayed the same? And the second question was, would you rather return to Russia if the political situation improves, while the economic situation is still the same? So in the second cohort B, those who immigrated from 2012, there was a significantly larger proportion of those who would rather go back if the political situation changes, even regardless of the economic situation in the country. That was statistically significant within our sample. So that's an important thing. And the other thing, which I just want to very quickly remark upon, 41% of the youngsters, 18, 24 years old, is only 41% for some, and it's as many as 41% for the others. So the dynamics even of Levada Center studies shows that this percentage is growing.
But I agree, 41% is very significant. Some. But Elizaveta, you helped us put together this report out in San Francisco. Your sense as, again, your view of the reasons for leaving as described in the report, how does that seem to you? You have a very broad set of network within the Russian diaspora in the United States and elsewhere in the West. And also, your take on Evgenia's point about people in the diaspora being willing to go back at a certain point.
First, let me stress my gratitude to you for me being a part of this event. That's really important for me because this issue I have passion about. Why? I can explain. Because I also have my personal, besides the Bell and other stuff, I have my personal blog on YouTube that is called Russians Are Okay, that has over than 50,000 subscribers. And here I see my mission to show to other people that Russian entrepreneurs, people who left Russia or who stay in Russia, can be successful global entrepreneurs. And you can't imagine how many people of Russian identity build very successful companies in US and all over the world, not only here. And the valuation of this company, I think total valuation is about $100 billion. I don't know, I didn't make accurate research, but there are a lot of people who built unicorns and companies that cost 500 million and so on and so forth. And to make this 25 interviews, I had to search and dig much more bigger amount of and collect much more information. And those 52 minutes interviews then in fact require 2, 3, 5 hours interviews. So I had also very qualitative research made on my own. So, and I have here few important features to share. First of all, most of those people don't identify themselves as Russians. And this is their pain point. They can't identify themselves as Russians because they disagree basically with major principles on which Russia lives now. And this is not only about politics, but it's about opportunities for them and their children, and their opportunities to build companies, to make successful business, to develop technologies. So they definitely need, they not just want, but they need to be in alignment with the world, because that's the only way to build successful company and to build successful business or develop something for 1 billion people that they have passion to do. So they identify themselves as a global Russian. And, but at the same time, this category doesn't exist. Because what is the idea, for example, to be a Jew or to be Armenian? This community has very strong idea to go back. And that's the only idea that keeps diaspora alive, right? So they somewhere they have a homeland, and this is a beautiful homeland. They want to build this homeland. So global Russians, they exist in the cloud because they don't have idea to go back in my observations. So of course many of them really proud to be Russians. And maybe those people made me more to be proud that I'm Russian than I used before. But they have no place to go back, not only because of ideology, but also because it's very hard today to build something successful, being fixed and stay just in Russia, not to be global. This is first observation. Another observation is that they, although they somehow support opposition, there is no opposition leader or party that would represent their interests. Because the only opposition leader that obviously Russia has is Navalny, but Navalny for them is too socialist. So they don't believe in values that, they don't share values he promotes. So they need something more capitalist and more liberal in terms of libertarian, in terms of economics. And the third thing is that some of them, not everyone, sometimes just being afraid of identifying themselves as Russians publicly. I seriously got a few refusal to conduct interview because people said we just don't need to speak Russian on YouTube. It might be harmful for our business, and we don't need problems with banks and our investors and so on and so forth. And I have to blame slightly American media in that, and I'm glad that you have this recommendation to distinguish politics and distinguish people, Russians and Russians, because it's very frequently when I see in US headlines or first paragraph that Russians made this, Russians made. Who are those? Am I those? Am I this Russian who made this, or this investor? So
Again, you know, we at the Eurasia Center are known as sharp critics of Kremlin policy, and we always speak of either the Kremlin, Moscow, or President Putin himself. We almost never use Russians or Russia, per se.
So that's why Russians are okay. That's the idea that I want to promote.
Right.
Russians are okay.
Right. Okay, now, Evgeny, I'm not going to let you escape. You said something, from my mind, which I think is true, but others would say is extremely optimistic. You said that the Putin regime will end, and something, essentially, you didn't quite put it this way, but you were heading in that direction, rather liberal will emerge. And you said then all these Russians who've been trained in Western companies and Western universities will come back. Am I right to characterize it that way? You think, okay, good. Now, so I want to draw that to people's attention, because this is one of the sharpest political minds in Moscow. So people should understand that. Now, I want to flip from there to you, Elizaveta, because your response to my question essentially assumed that something like what Evgenia said could not happen. Now, were that to happen, how do you think that would impact the people with whom you have lots and lots of contact?
Thank you for this question. It's a very thoughtful question, because if we go back 10 years ago or 15 years ago,
Right.
I personally know 10 people who been raised in US, for example, or who immigrated to US when they were 10 or 14. They came back to Russia in 2000s with the idea to make creative business, innovative business. And they succeeded in it. They worked for world-known accelerators. They worked for large media companies. They brought money to Russia. So that's very likely possible, but it's not. I wouldn't say this is just combination. This is just politics or just business opportunities. This is combination of factors that present Russia as a country of opportunities for creating something modern and novel. But it confronts with the idea that Evgenia has, that successor of current Kremlin will be necessarily liberal.
She didn't say success, she said eventually.
I didn't say success.
Eventually.
Your point was eventually, correct? Over time.
When is that eventually? So that's
We shouldn't use Naim, right?
Yes, we don't know. So that's why I doubt that we'll observe this massive coming back in coming 10 years or so.
We don't need massive.
You don't need.
We don't need massive. If you once again, judging by the Georgian
No, you want
example, which is so evident and so in a way successful, given that Georgia was it's a small country, but it was a total failed state, right? By the time Mikhail Saakashvili became the president, and the infliction of Georgians from United States, from France, from Russia, Kakha Bendukidze, one of the key guys in orchestrating the fight against corruption, top-level corruption in Georgia, he came from Russia. So we don't need a lot, but we do need people who are very well educated, who do understand modern economics and modern politics, who are not surprised by the word institutionalism and norms, and who have some understanding of, what we call common good. You may call it socialism. I call it, a very, in fact, modern approach to the current economics. So, yes, I do think that that's important, because people are bigger than just money. One of my problems with your people who give you interviews, and I watch some of them, is that people are greater than just the amount of millions or billions they have in their bank account. People are bigger than that.
You watched interviews poorly, because we don't discuss Money are not so important.
It's not.
I mean, I'm talking about Russia as country of opportunities. And, you know, Singapore is in some way authoritarian state, but this is a country of opportunities. China is a totalitarian state, but it's a country of opportunities. Please compare just amount of ventures in China and Russia in recent years. I mean, it's a different setup of goals and reasons. People with whom I'm talking, they are creators. It's not so important for me how, I mean, money just an issue of valuation, how people measure success. I mean, in business, people measure success in numbers. But the guy who created the company, that genetic testing company, or the guy who created space, last mile in space delivery company, that is heavily invested and backed by US money and Y Combinator, and so on and so forth. Those are breakthrough in science, in technology, in business, in everything. So I think this is a future, and it should be a future for Russia too, as well. I wish Russia would have this future.
Okay. Sergei, again, your big role in the report, you focused on the issue of the maintenance of ties between people who've left and Russia itself. So your sense, if in fact Yevgeny is right, and over time we see the emergence of a much more liberal Russia, a much freer Russia, what does that do with the emigres? Do they come back in some number?
Well, our data from the survey shows low figures, slightly higher for the second cohort. But what provides real wealth of data is the focus groups. When you talk to those people, first of all, I want to make a small remark. We are not talking about that small population dealt with by Yelizaveta, the brightest, really the most successful startups, and more than that. We are not talking about possible future Bendukidzes or people who could come like through Georgia and run the government. We are talking about the ordinary people. That was our methodology. Get down to earth, try to talk to those people in the Bay Area, in New York, in Berlin, and in London, who are representative, more or less.
So do you believe Bay Area has ordinary people? I haven't met even one.
I'll tell you more about that, and I will probably share more of my focus group with people in the Bay Area. Everything differs, and there are interesting differences between the four locations, also answering John's question. So they have different ideas of Russia and going back, but significantly, they're very, very similar in most respects, which shows that they are all part of global economy. They are all globally aware much more than the previous wave. They know the languages much better than the previous wave. They're better educated, more or less equally distributed. Don't think that in California the number of doctors is significantly higher than in London.
Russians who speak languages, you know, who are well educated, ordinary Russians.
Ordinary
really.
Russian
With
emigres.
master's degrees and PhD.
Okay, one more remark. We already referred to the Levada figure, 41% of those who have some immigration moods. Talking to these populations abroad in the four locations, it's a radical difference. It's not an intention, it's
Tell
not a
them which
mood.
four locations, we haven't mentioned that.
Oh yeah, the four locations I just mentioned: the Bay Area, New York metropolitan area, the Greater London, and Berlin, Brandenburg. So the key, as we can call it, settlement hubs, which continue to attract the brightest and most entrepreneurial Russians within the most recent wave. So these people whom we tried to select, we didn't select successful startups, we just went to anyone. And among those people, and the focus groups, of course, show that much better than the survey, there are some ideas about going back. There's a lot of skepticism about the future liberal government. There are many critics of Navalny among these people. But in general, when they hear the figure that such and such number of new Russian emigres support the idea of Navalny running for for presidency, they all agree, they all understand that. And they would like to somehow participate, some of them. And they understand the figures when you say that this proportion are willing to donate, still slightly greater proportion are willing to somehow participate in the campaign, to express their open support online, for example. So in that way, all these people are interested in Russian politics. They have much stronger connection to their country of exodus, to their friends, to the social capital left behind in Russia. And in that way, it's hard to really distinguish the intention, the strong intention to go back to Russia or to be a part of Russia in some way. So they are much more open to that compared to the previous wave, which they described. So it's a self-perception of this group of emigres, of course.
Of course, let me
Please,
jump on that,
jump in.
because I think I have to agree with you on this topic of connection, because modern social media and other networks and speed of with which you can just move to Russia if you need is now changed the whole process of immigration. People don't immigrate, they just move. They don't feel this like, I immigrated, and like they can go back and forth, and they can be in contact with their friends all the time, 24 hours. And they are. And they have friends everywhere. So they indeed became more global Russians, more global rather than Russians in this sense.
Well, just to conclude, trying to answer John's question, I think such questions have now to be put in the context of this indeed much more global world, people with wider set of skills, better languages, and when they don't often feel that they really need to physically return to the country. But it's a totally different question. It's the question of opportunity in the future, whether there will be a real liberal government eventually, and some of these people will be called for. So they will feel an urge to go back to Russia. So the feeling, talking to these people, that sentiment is present there. You can't deny that. It may seem insignificant, you know, the whole thing may seem insignificant if you consider the number of new Russian emigres voting in America, like whether they at all can affect American politics, no. But there are things which can't be omitted. We have to take them into account. That's our duty, and that's why such type of research is really seminal.
Evgeny, do you want to jump in here on this or not?
I think it's a lovely discussion. It just when time comes, we will see.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Okay.
I'm a very practical person. So
okay.
I live where I live, and there is.
Let me ask then you a practical question. You referred to, and Sergei also referred to, this latest Levada Center poll, which showed that 41% of 18 to 24-year-olds would consider seriously leaving Russia. I think not only is that a significant number, I think this is the first time of which I'm aware of, but I may be missing something, that the Kremlin responded to these figures. And we've had years of stories about people leaving Russia, and the Kremlin's been largely silent. But Putin's spokesman, Peskov, consciously derided that figure and referred to other figures about a majority of people who want to stay in Russia. Of course, a majority want to stay. So my question for you is there now a new understanding in the Kremlin that this phenomenon is a political liability?
Thank you very much for your question. I think that given that Vladimir Putin is in power the last 19 years, more than Leonid Brezhnev, Kremlin now is trying to portray him as a sort of a messianic person. That he's not. And that's the problem, because if he's a messianic personality, that people should come from all countries back to Moscow and to Russia and embrace him. So, and of course it's what can you do? How can you be happy about the fact that young people are living en masse because there is no social mobility whatsoever, because it's impossible to start business in Russia, because even if you do and you're successful and you're loyal and you kiss all them in their lips and you end up in jail like it happened with Michael Calvi last week, then of course, it creates a little bit of problem. How you're going to say that, he's a great leader of the country from which people run away?
Right.
So it all implies that it's time for him to go.
Okay.
That's what, when you ask me about the change of the regime,
Right.
I do believe that it's time for Vladimir Putin to go. Because I really don't want to see in Russia what we're seeing now in Venezuela. After all, I think, comparatively speaking, he's a little bit smarter than Maduro. So anyway, I'm just, guessing.
Okay. Thank you for those very restrained remarks. One part of my job is to try and pull strings together, and I'll do that here. Sergei and Elizaveta had a little bit of a disagreement regarding people who are part of this, of our discussion. Because Sergei said we were dealing with, relatively speaking, ordinary people, although Elizaveta pointed out they're not that
Extraordinary.
ordinary. No, that's
I
right.
would say
But hold on, wait.
extraordinary.
But you were really talking about the cream of the crop, the extraordinary within the extraordinary, the very, very successful entrepreneurs. And I'm making this distinction, and this comes back also to your point, Evgenia. When I was a graduate student, I was told to read a book, The Political Class by Gaetano Mosca, an Italian social scientist. He wrote it about 100 years ago. I strongly recommend that to everybody in this room. Mosca's thesis is that societies are created and sustained by their elite. Both the very top elite, like the folks you were referring to, who really create things, and then the secondary elite, Sergei's folks, who are the cadres, and they will define the success of a country or not. And I think there's a lot to that thesis. Now, putting that together within our conversation, the folks you were referring to, the guys who really create companies and jobs, who define the future, they're the ones who are most nervous about being in Russia. And this both speaks to Evgenia's point and what I said at the beginning. Another way to address this is, why are there not lots of Steve Jobs, Peruski in Russia? And I think the answer was given by what Evgenia said, and actually you pointed this too. Some really smart young Russian who's got a lot of oomph and creates a viable company, which is suddenly earning hundreds of thousands of rubles, is vulnerable to that police captain or that FSB captain somewhere in the provinces. And poof, whatever he's gotten is gone. Whereas here, that doesn't happen. Now, is that, do you think, I'll address you, Elizaveta, a reason why we see these folks who you talk to comfortable here?
I think it's more complex.
Okay, please.
I can explain why it's more complex. To become an extraordinary, or to find extraordinary, you need to search through like dozens and hundreds of ordinary
Hundreds
but
of thousands.
talented,
Yeah.
because only one of 100 succeeds.
Right.
Because 99% of startups fail.
Right.
But you need to be able, and you need to have this, guts and bug in the country.
Right.
So it's more complex just than FSB officer. The whole culture and startup environment and innovation environment is not in favor in the country so much. And the government, to its honor, tries, one part of the government tries, but those attempts are sink or dying in other attempts. And for example, this Calvi arrest is very remarkable, because he was a prominent investor, and he is, into successful Russian companies. that country should proud of. So it's a very complex problem, and many countries, by the way, struggle to receive this status of Silicon Valley of Europe, Silicon Valley of Asia, Silicon Valley or second Silicon Valley. New York competes with San Francisco for being this. Boston area competes with New York.
But
and
Queens
so on and
does
so forth.
not.
Huh?
Queens does not.
Just Queens.
Gone.
So yeah, and I think, generally speaking, the government should also think about this missing opportunity.
Okay. I think one fact is a way to describe the problem that we're discussing. My understanding, Evgeny, I appreciate your comments on this, is that far and away the most popular school of higher education in Russia is the FSB Academy.
FSB Academy #1, MVD, that's internal polls number 2, and I think but because young people, they don't know. So we wrote tons of stuff on that, because young people, they do understand that you can become rich out of being in the bureaucracy.
Right.
It's precise. That's precisely the poor problem.
Right.
That the whole value they see in their future is to be in the business to be in the position where they can extract rent.
Right. If you're looking,
that's the problem.
If you're looking for a simple point of contrast, the smart American wants to go to Harvard Business School to create wealth. The smart Russians wants to go to the FSB Academy so he could confiscate wealth. That's obviously a simplification, but how do you react to that?
How can I react to that? I'm
shrug will
very
do.
sorry, and I think it's a huge problem. But once again, I can tell you, I remember when I was to Georgia, and I spoke to this then new government of Georgia and to different people. And then, the day I left, Saakashvili crashed on the opposition demonstration in Tbilisi. And I called Kacha Bendukidze, who was a very good friend of mine, a great mind that all of us will miss tremendously who knew him. And I said, Kacha, what are you doing? What's going on? And he said, we will have to start from the very beginning. So all I can tell you, we will have to start from the very beginning. Unfortunately, there has been done a lot in terms of of the social capital in Russia, but last 10 years at least was a real disaster in that respect. But you know what? Since you used this analogy to the Jewish Bible and to the second book of Moses, let me say this: in Jewish Bible there is no such a thing as Exodus. The book is not called Exodus; it's called Shmot, names. Because in Jewish philosophy, Exodus happens every year. In fact, during the Passover, we say time and again, when we repeat the story of Jewish Exodus from Egypt, we say time and again that we are becoming slaves. We're enslaved by our bosses, by the situation, etc. So what's really important is that during the last 2 decades of the new Russia, people obtained their names, Shmot. That's what's important. That people started to recognize themselves as individuals, as opposed just the Soviet mass that bared very few real faces. Therefore, in that respect, I have no chance but to be optimistic. You understand this, right? So I have to be, and I do think that there is this new generation of Russian people who already tasted the fruits of freedom and free expression, and that's why Alexei Navalny and people around him, they have such a huge support base, you know. There are almost 3 million people who subscribed to Navalny YouTube channel. He basically created, you know, a TV media on YouTube. So it all, you know, I'm a strong believer in Tikkun Olam. I strongly believe that we are all here to make the world a better place. And there are, you know, there are a couple of things to do in this country as well, as you may be aware as we read about this, of course. So, you know.
Okay, thank you. Sergei, you want to have a last word before we turn to the audience?
Yes.
Please.
Well, again, that's a whole set of questions of methodology, where you look, who you look at, what are your more detailed research questions. And of course, there is a much wider context, and it's a great chance to look at wider issues here, including the future of Russian government, including the unpredictability of how the brightest, the cream of the crop, will look at the situation if it changes. What we have at the moment is a kind of first step. Now, the very first step, if you look at some other small studies conducted through the last 5 years, but it's the first step when we actually go into the data, into the field, and we see certain things which bring hope, which testify that the strive for liberation, emancipation, obtaining a name, becoming a nation. This is one of the themes which transpire in our focus groups. How can you feel a Russian in the new age, in the new situation? Can you at all be a Russian? And of course, there are different answers. Some people are trying not to show themselves as Russians. They don't mingle together. They don't create traditional émigré communities. They don't. But they have some idea of their homeland, which can be territorial, but can be more than territorial. The critical question for them is whether their children will remain Russians, linguistically, culturally, in every location, especially in Berlin, but also in New York and other places. They really express that concern. They want to retain that identity, even if the whole world goes global.
Okay, thank you. Elizaveta, I'll give you the last word before we turn to the audience. Anything?
Yeah, just to end on an optimistic point, I want to say that Russian identity is really, really strong. And observing not only top of the top, but also students, PhD students at Stanford, I discovered that there is a little group of Russian students at Stanford who gather in several weeks, once in several weeks, and they sing Russian songs. I mean, they sing Viktor Tsoi and Krematoriy and other like popular rock songs, and they don't sing American songs or German songs or others. So they still have this very, very strong identity that brings people of different generations, different backgrounds, with math skills, with humanitarian skills, and like social studies from different groups together, and keep them together. Well, that's very important.
If that includes Stenka Razin and Katyusha, I'm all for it.
No.
No. Okay, good enough. Questions right here. Okay.
Thank you very much. This is Voice of America, Daniel Gilpert. Before I ask my question to Zhenya, I wanted to tell you, John, that exactly the phrase you just pronounced, that young people who are coming to be student in FSB Academy or something else are more than who is trying to join business schools and so on, was pronounced by Mikhail Khodorkovsky in 2003 to the face of Vladimir Putin. And since then, we have a whole new generation. It was 16 years ago, and it still goes on. I mean, this is important. Zhenya, my question is, what leads you to opinion that Russia eventually will be at least more liberal than in times of Putin? Can you just make a list of factors? Thank you.
It's a good question. You know, I studied the Red Sunset, the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you go through the literature on Red Sunset, you would see that nobody, just nobody, predicted the Red Sunset. The expectations were that Soviet Union was going to stay forever. There was one article written by Stephen Cohen in 1988, I believe, where he said that, you know, the situation may go south for Soviets. There was famous Marshall Goldman's book, USSR in Crisis, for which he was criticized all around in each and every think tank and each and every academic article. But basically, Goldman, late Marshall Goldman, predicted that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. I think so. If you ask me with respect to the current situation, you know, Russia now is a corporate state run by a corporation, graduates of the KGB, people who are not exactly very well educated and very smart. But there are interests even inside this corporate state that are looking for more opened Russia and for Russia more receptive to the foreign technologies or Western technologies and Western capitals. So there are pragmatic interests inside Russia who will be looking for less clandestine and less corrupted regime that exists in the current Russia. As it was at the end of the Soviet Union, when there were two major groups of interests, as we know now. One which was looking for the opening of the Soviet Union, that was predominantly those who were involved in all kind of energy resources, oil, gas, etc. These people were looking for opening the Soviet Union, as opposed to those who were involved in the military-industrial complex, who were interested in closed borders, and etc., etc. Exactly this, more or less the same, you can see in the current Russia. We can talk, it's a very interesting topic. And I can outline you in, the specific state-owned corporations. There are 10 major corporations in Russia, state-owned corporations, all run by the KGB guys, but they are different. There is the tensions or different interests between those graduates of the KGB who were in the intelligence and those graduates of the KGB who were in the counterintelligence. And they represent a different approach to the current Russian domestic and foreign politics. So the clash of interests that always exists and existed in the Soviet Union and led to the collapse of the Soviet Union eventually. So the clash of these interests exists in the current Russia as well, and these what will become the vehicle of the regime collapse. We often, political science, we refer to these as the breakup of the elite. I believe that it's more complicated than that. But to cut the long story short, yes, there are interests, very pragmatic interests, in the contemporary Russia who are in favor of ending up these KGB spell over the country and opening the country to the new technologies and Western capitals. Oil businesses suffer enormously because of the sanctions, because they stopped all their explorations in Arctica, which Putin proclaimed, a couple of years ago as the future, where we have to, polar bears, our friends, So anyway, so precisely because of sanctions, they're lacking technologies that they need to explore oil fields in Arctica. There are problems. There are businesses, Russian businesses who are there. They do need access to the Western capitals. For one, Western money are Western money are very cheap. They got accustomed to run their businesses on the 4-5% interest that they used to pay, on Western capital, as opposed to capitals in Russia, which is at least 14% interest. So there are all kinds of interests, and we can be very, very specific about that. This is an extremely interesting topic.
Either Russia changes or becomes a third-rate country, and I don't think it's going to happen. Sandy's next.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much, Sandy Vershbow, former ambassador and now at the Atlantic Council. Congratulations on a very interesting report. I find it very sad because I was ambassador during Putin's first term when there was a real spirit of entrepreneurship. A lot of people were coming back in those days, and we tried to encourage that, but obviously we can only influence Russia's internal choices on the margins. Of course, one group that isn't emigrating, unfortunately, is the weapons designers. Putin reminded us yesterday that they still have no brain drain problems when it comes to designing the Sarmat and the Avant-Garde and all these other great systems. But a question about some aspects of your research. Was there any discernible trend regarding emigration to Ukraine among Russian entrepreneurs and intelligentsia, sort of seeing that as a place where you could continue to develop a free society, a civil society, while that remains impossible in Russia? I know journalists have moved to Ukraine, but is there any broader trend? And also, is there anything different as between non-Russian nationalities in terms of the trends towards emigration, particularly in the wake of the efforts in the last few years by the Putin regime to suppress regional autonomy and even the use of regional and local languages? Is there an immigration among the non-Russian nationalities on a par with that of the Russians, ethnic Russians?
Why don't you take the second one about?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Okay, the second one, if you mean by non-Russian nationalities, you mean ethnic minorities. This is a very striking fact about the new immigration we call the Putin Exodus, that it's much more pronounced as ethnically Russian. More than 70% of our sample identify themselves as Russians. So it's not Jewish, it's not German or Greek immigration predominantly, it is a Russian immigration. But at the same time, this ethnic component is not really very much expressed. These people don't emphasize that they are Russians. They are Russians as citizens of Russia. And at the same time, it's true, the new wave demonstrates that the immigration is now flowing from a greater variety of regions in Russia, including ethnic regions, including places like Tatarstan, Bashkortostan. So these people, in one of my focus groups in New York, I even had absolutely accidentally, because their last names were Russian sounding, but they were Kalmyk, two of them. It just happened. And they talked about similar things and different things, and about suppressing ethnicities and the racism is in Russia, which is also a factor which is not very often discussed, because they look very Asian, they feel racism in the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. But the other huge factor, overwhelming factor, especially in New York, is homophobia in Russia today. So comparing with other countries, we can't really answer that because we were focused on Russia, not Ukraine. We know that the destination geography has been growing tremendously. Also, some creative Russians have emigrated to Ukraine. And there is a branch of Free Russia Foundation opened in Kiev, as we know. So some people are looking at Ukraine as a possible destination. But what remains really the focus still, why we focused on these 4 locations, is the West.
Thank you. Elaine.
Elaine Sorrell, I'm the Associate Rector of Ukrainian American Concordia University in Kiev, Ukraine. I have sort of emerging between the last couple of questions, so I'm going to revise what I was going to ask. When we're talking about people leaving diaspora because of economic, political, and all the reasons you've already stated, and then we're talking about other countries where diaspora has returned to reinforce the country's new growth, such as in Georgia, and indeed Ukraine, as Ambassador Herbst pointed out, particular individuals. Where do we see this possibly happening in Russia if, as you've defined, the population that's left, particularly after 2012, are not identifying themselves per se as a Russian diaspora looking to return to a homeland in the future, but rather being able to build their own presence, their own identity, which includes their Russian overlay, but they don't take it as solely their identity. Their identity has become global business, entrepreneur, and the flexibility of I can do this anywhere, and they may not be the ones that choose to return at a later point because they no longer feel that they have to go back and readdress the situation.
We probably have to say that, we're not talking, I'm not, when I talk about Russians who are going to respond to calling and return back to Russia after, the current regime collapses and we will have a new Russia, there are all what we call in political science and democratization variables. They're all in place. Russia has a very educated population. Russia has a highly industrialized country, Russia economy. Russia is very urbanized country, and there is pretty developed means of communications. So basically, everything, from the standpoint of the democratic theory, everything is there. Everything is there. You don't need really to move, all those who left Russia back to Russia in order to establish democratic Russia. We have all these people there. You see, but unfortunately the country is controlled by crooks and spooks. And that's the problem. It's not the problem, yes, we can solve, you can say about, lack of education, that, there is, variables in terms of trust are very low and all this kind of stuff. There are a lot of problems. But we don't need really, to send, former Russians from the United States or France or Israel. Yes, we do need Sergei Erofeev, of course, to come back to Moscow, or no question asked. There are specific people who we will need in order to establish the new government, and there will be huge necessity to kick out all these corrupted professors out of universities and but anyway, other than that, everything is there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Nadia in the back. We'll come over here later.
Nadia McConnell, U.S. Ukraine Foundation. A couple of questions based on...
One question, Nadia. We got a lot of people.
Okay. Well, it's one and the same question. Has your study divided the attitudes of the different immigration waves? Because that's what we find in the Ukrainian community, that each wave has very different motivations. And the second question...
No, that's it.
Okay.
It's okay.
This
Sorry.
is very Short and simple. We only looked at the recent wave, people who started to migrate from the year 2000, and that was their self-perception of their own wave, and that was their perception of the previous waves. And the difference is drastic.
Okay. Question here, and then we'll move over to here. This lady over in the middle. We need a microphone over here. Thank you.
I'll be quick, Kathy Cosman. Thank you so much for this important study. I hope there can be made available more detailed studies of the previous ways of immigration, and that some way could be found of publicizing that. And I would suggest that surveys be conducted in Turkey, because there are many ethnic, Russian citizens who are Muslim who have had to flee Russia due to systematic persecution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Harley, then here.
Thank you. Harley Balzer, Georgetown University. Just a quick footnote. If 70% of the people who have immigrated are Russian, that would make the non-Russians, who are only 20% of the population, slightly more than their share of the Russian population?
Again, the survey is not representative, but you can speculate further and say that those who immigrate are more active, ergo there is a significantly larger proportion of those more active among non-Russian minorities, but that's a speculation.
Okay, good.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. I'm going to assume that some fraction of these guys are working for the SVR. There's a big problem in Russia, demographically, of course. It's got to be killing them that this is happening. And I'm wondering if we look at big cities, small cities, and countryside, whether each of those environments is represented in the current immigration. Or is it overwhelmingly big city guys?
Okay, yes, still the majority immediately come from Moscow and St. Petersburg. But the trend, which is clearly shown by our focus groups, is that in the recent years, Moscow and St. Petersburg are more and more used as springboards by people from the Russian regions in order to immigrate. So there are more and more actually people coming from the Russian regions, all the regions. Some stand out, maybe not so much from small towns. You really have to be in a big regional center in order to start that itinerary.
Okay, thank you. In the back.
Luka Kubidashvili. So I realize that this is not the focus of your research, but if you could perhaps intuitively, if you have observed differences in attitudes with the people who emigrate to more opulent parts of the West, to places of post-Soviet space, and could it be that Kremlin is perhaps encouraging immigration to these places? And if I may load the question a little bit, would be that I have personally observed that immigrants to Georgia that have come before 2012 were more bohemian, even entrepreneurial people, and later they were more nationalistic people. So what is the Kremlin's attitude towards this?
Evgeny, you want to try that?
I'm not sure I got the question.
What was he's asking, lately, is the Kremlin asking people to go to places like he mentioned Georgia in particular, essentially for foreign policy reasons, because he says before 2012, Russians who came to Georgia were somewhat bohemian in outlook and entrepreneurial. Afterwards, more nationalistic. It's like building the Ruski Mir, is what he's asking.
To be honest with you, I just don't know.
Okay. Anyone else want to address this? This is highly speculative. Okay, we have a question over here, and then over there.
Thank you all very much. I'm wondering about any immigration to Israel, which is sometimes called the startup nation. You mentioned that the number of Jewish people represented in the latest waves is not very high. But of course, the refuseniks went to Israel. Now we're talking 20, 30 years ago, and they've established a foothold there, and they're here too. So do you have any data about, one, connections with Israel and the people who settled there from the Soviet Union? It wouldn't have only been Russia. And then in the United States, connections to the diaspora here that came from Russia with the refusenik generation.
Again, very brief, because we looked only at this specific population, and they're very self-centered in their descriptions, and they can only give some indirect impression of the previous wave. The most important thing that they observe about the previous wave, that they're really much more conservative and would be more centered around specific culture, not Russian civic identity, but a specific culture.
Let me add, because I don't have very detailed quantitative studies, but there is a whole phenomenon called Putin's Aliyah, if you understand the meaning of Aliyah. There were a lot of people who, and there have been maybe a lot of people who standed in the line to Israeli embassy in big cities to get Israeli citizenship, and most of those people are highly educated people who try to start their businesses in Israel, as I know by talking to people.
Okay, thank you. Over here.
Mike Roches. Is the compulsory military service still a factor in the large amount of immigration?
Yes, it is. It's down to just 1 year, and there is a huge degree of avoidance of that military service. People from Moscow, from Chechnya, never served in the Russian army. But for some people from the countryside, from small towns, it's still a kind of mobility step.
Evgeny, you want to add to this?
First of all, I think there is certain, there were certain reforms and positive reforms done with respect to the Russian army. So for young people from the poor upbringings, from the small cities, service in the army is the way of social mobility. Therefore, there is much less military avoidance now than it was, say, 10 years ago. It's the way for people, for young people to make some money, and unfortunately, that's what drove them to go to Donbass, and and they were used en masse there.
Okay, thank you. Last question over here.
Alexander Naumov, George Mason University. I want to reference an earlier panel here at the Atlantic Council about Russian information space, where the panelists presented the fact that Russians abroad can often be more likely to have pro-Kremlin views because they're still connected to the state-run media. They still watch Russia Today, but they don't see the reality of how the regions live. And you see that the way that they often, those that vote at embassies and consulates, those locations have higher votes for Putin percentages than in Russia. So with the people that you talked to, how did their political views change after they came to these countries? And more importantly, how did they stay the same?
Okay. As we went with our research, there have been multiple interactions, personal communications. We looked at the issue of the most recent presidential elections, Russians voting in America in particular. It wasn't the focus of our research, but everybody knows more or less that the degree of propaganda in America with the Russian diaspora has been really immense compared to the previous instances. And the percentage of those voting for Putin this time was higher. But when you talk to our sample representatives, to our focus groups, it's very clear that their political views are dispersed all along the spectrum, but compared to the first wave, or to the first cohort of our wave, there are fewer nationalists, fewer communists, and many more people who hold right liberal views.
There's one other, I think, element here. This is anecdotal. I don't have data for it, but based upon observation. A fair number of the old emigration, the white Russians who've been here for generations, responded positively to Putin's leadership, the reassertion of Russian power. And a lot of those organizations, which were fiercely anti-communist, have now become advocates for the president, for President Putin. And you see a high degree of nationalism in those organizations. I don't know how many of those people have subsequently applied for Russian citizenship to vote in their election, but that's also a factor. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank our panelists. And again, we hope to do more in this space.